Jeremy smiled when Ma's face filled his tablet. It was his first mail he'd received since he had left Earth.
Hey, honey, we got your mail. We're all really happy that you found steady work so quickly,
she said. She was at the town's library. Despite the fact that wireless was free and available everywhere on Earth's surface, they had never gotten around to getting a computer, much less tablets or a modem. Still, it was good to hear from her.
Your pa and I had a pretty good laugh when we heard your captain was a movie buff. I know you like those old movies, but I think she might give you a run for your money,
she said. But then her voice lowered to a whisper.
Is she single? I know your pa wouldn't approve, but I think you need to explore the possibilities, like Captain Kirk.
If Jeremy's eyes could roll any harder, he felt like they'd detach and roll across the floor.
Mom!
He shouted at the recording.
Long as it ain't one of them damn Pathrans, leave that boy alone about that. Here, let me talk to him.
His father shouted. Several patrons shooed him, to which he loudly replied,
My son's an engineer. In space, y'all calm your tits.
Jeremy wanted to bury his face, but he had to admit that it was pretty funny, especially since he didn't have to witness his embarrassment firsthand.
How you doing, boy?
He started.
Your ma and I are pretty proud of you. Always have been. Just wanted you to know that.
He trailed off a bit. Something was on his mind. Pa wiped his face with his hand, which he usually did when he was uncomfortable.
Well, I'm just gonna come out and say it, but we appreciate the money you sent. It helped us out of a bind. Your sister went and fell off Roxy the other day and got dragged damn near a mile before her foot came out of that stirrup. She's okay, though. Broken leg and some sprains, but she'll be all right soon enough.
Jeremy sat up, intent on what else was going on.
And well, there's more bad news. Our tomatoes got ate up by worms. We couldn't afford the spraying, so we just prayed. But sure enough, them worms got to 'em. We really thought we were screwed this time, but Ma went to the bank and there was this $3,000 deposit sitting in there.
Jeremy had almost forgotten about the exchange rate. A smile crept onto his face.
So we were able to get bills paid and L fixed up and even got the pumpkin sprayed. So we should be set for a while. Thank you, son.
He leaned back in his bunk with a smirk. That's not a one-off, Pa.
Anyway, so your siblings are off at school, but I'll make sure they get in here to send you a mail soon. We love you, son. You take care now.
Ma leaned in.
Love you, Jeremy.
He sat there for a minute, thinking about what he just witnessed. Ma always told him she loved him. With Pa, well, it was usually implied. He tried to remember the last time, if there was one, when he came right out and said it. He just felt happy that he could help them out.
Jeremy's subtle.
Dee blurped into his comm.
Yes, Dakin Burtontum?
He replied.
Close, but not quite. Sila wants you up on the bridge.
He said.
I'll be there in 5.
He said. It was Jeremy's day off, but being the only engineer on board, he was pretty much always on call. When he got to the bridge, it felt a little empty.
Sela?
He asked the pilot, another Pa'arthan named Ekorinamina.
Office,
He said without turning away from his console. Office was a strong word when it came to the captain's office. Jeremy thought it was along the same lines of calling the trunk of a car, a cargo area. There wasn't much room except for a desk, a chair, and several monitors, so he kept the door open to save on space.
Come in
She said, not taking her eyes from the screen she was looking at.
and close the door.
Jeremy squeezed inside, having to nearly step to the other side of the desk to get the door shut.
Ma'am?
She smiled.
We're not that formal, Jeremy.
That's the first time you've just used my first name.
He noticed aloud.
I can always go back to calling you Jeremy Subtle if you like.
No, it's not that, but why?
He asked.
Do they not teach you etiquette in college?
Some, but it's pretty general. The Federation has thousands of races in it.
He replied.
For Pa'arthans, we refer to strangers by their full name.
She said, tapping something on the screen, then looking right at him with a smile.
I no longer consider you a stranger.
I see.
He said, feeling that the small room must have a ventilation problem he'd have to add to his ever-growing to-do list.
Anyway, I know it's your day off, but there's something you need to see.
She said, turning a monitor toward him. It was camera footage of the ventral door console, The day he almost got crushed,
Watch.
she said, tapping the screen again. He focused on the screen. Not much of anything besides the panel and the actual door. Suddenly, the indicator switched and the door began to open.
The hell?
Shh, not so loud.
She whispered.
Watch the timestamp.
He watched again.
It jumps.
Yes.
She said dryly.
So we don't know who did it. We just know that it was deliberate. Well,
She glanced at him from the corner of her eye.
Well?
we do have other cameras throughout the ship. I can account for everyone except 3 of the crew.
Oh.
Yes, Dakenbert Tatum, Reese, the second watch pilot, and
And?
me.
She said somberly.
Well, unless you were going to try and skimp on paying my salary, I doubt it was you.
He said jokingly. A hurt glance reminded him about how literal what he just said was taken.
Sorry, I don't think it was you,
He said.
Just be careful, Jeremy.
She said.
I'll try my best. This is a little outside what I had in mind when we talked about risk, though.
This is unforeseen. The risks I was referring to might result in a few months of incarceration, not getting killed.
She said. Her finger went to her lips, then she slammed her chair backward and shouted,
Get the cargo lift fixed, Jeremy Suttle. You have 2 days.
Geez, okay.
He shouted back, opening the door.
And take your tablet with you.
She yelled, thrusting it toward him. He'd nearly forgotten that he had set it down on her desk. Down the hall, he opened it to find a note. Talk after shift. You know where. He shook his head.
The fuck did I get myself into?
He half muttered, half mumbled. It was definitely his day off, but he needed to clear his head, so he did the one thing he knew would get his mind off everything else, and that was work. He triple-checked his EVA suit for any surprises, grabbed his tools, and went for a walk. He'd take a quick peek at the lift motor while he was out, but since there were several lifts, the bigger problem was getting the beam transmitter back online. Most ports didn't mind open-air communication. In fact, the smaller ones encouraged it so they didn't have to work so hard to maintain traffic control. The big ones, however, like the one orbiting Perth, would cite them even though it was obviously damaged. That was their second stop from now, and only a week away. He jetted forward slowly, careful not to overshoot and miss, or worse, not miss. He passed the lift motor's paneling on his way. It'd be a bit of a detour, so he figured he'd come back after dinner. As he got close to the transmitter, he flipped on his headlamp and turned on his mag boots.
Oh man,
He said as his lights hit the transmitter.
What's wrong?
Echo Renamia asked.
what hit this thing? It's nearly shredded.
Oh, that. Well, there was that unmarked debris field we ran into a while back.
Right.
He said, remembering a prior conversation with Sella that explained most of their problems. Debris was dangerous, especially unmarked debris, and very especially unmarked debris traveling nearly a kpas relative. Jeremy turned and grabbed the tote that silently followed him and set it down, its magnetic lock engaging on its own. Opening it, he got the spool of optic cable ready.
The only expensive wire is a short wire. Her,
He said, mocking his former instructor. He was little embarrassed, realizing he was still on comm, and decided to keep his jokes to himself. He unscrewed what was left of the panel and was tempted to let it float away, but he'd just be adding to the debris problem. He tugged on the existing cable and it came without a hitch. Then he scaled the mast, disconnected it from that end as well, then made his way back to the base. He fed the sheared optic cable through the support mast, and realized halfway he needed to run a new power cable as well. He sighed, a little frustrated, and pulled the cable back out, taped the end of a power cable to it, and continued feeding it up the 10-meter mast. After he felt like he put about 10 meters worth of cable through the mast, he scaled it and found the end right where he expected it to be. The dish had a few dings in it, but it'd still work, maybe. The transmitter itself looked undamaged, which was good since he didn't have a spare. Reminding himself to tether, he pulled his line out and attached it to the mast. He wasn't far from the ship, and his EVA suit had plenty of fuel, but he'd rather not risk it. If something went wrong and he couldn't jet back, he'd be floating off into the night for a long time. After making his connections, he put everything back together and started making his way back. About halfway, something caught his periphery, but by the time he was able to rotate his whole suit to look, there was nothing but the ship and the stars.
The Black'll play tricks on you. Her.
He muttered quietly enough to not send it over comms again. Once back at the base, he made his connections there and gave Ikoronamia a call.
Everything looks good on my end, but we won't know for sure until we see another ship or port.
He reported.
Awesome, I'll be back in time for dinner,
Jeremy said happily. He got his materials and tools secured, carefully checking that he didn't leave anything behind. There were few worse feelings than realizing that the wire strippers you really need, like right now, were left on the outside of a 2-kilometer-long freighter in space. Doing some mental math, he figured he'd have just enough time to grab a quick bite before meeting Sela. Jeremy promised himself that he'd be more attentive in case she decided to ever drop another hint at him. He'd beaten himself up over the last one for nearly a week. To make matters worse, Dee had been poking fun at Jeremy for what he thought was a good tongue lashing, but in all likelihood could have been a tongue lashing of a different and more enjoyable variety. Or maybe he was reading too much into things? He grinned. He was deep in thought, and barely paying attention when something jarred him from behind. When Jeremy turned, the tote was exactly where it was supposed to be, but there simply wasn't anything out there. Maybe it wasn't paying attention either. A minute later, it happened again. This time, he caught the tote backing away from him. He punched it playfully. He laughed and said,
Hey, watch where the hell you're going.
Who?
He called.
Oh, nothing. My tote keeps bumping into me,
he said. Continuing forward, he discovered that concentrating was becoming more difficult. Something wasn't right, so he checked the suit's readouts on his wrist. What he saw made his throat tighten. He was leaking oxygen and fast. He had air, but the O2 tank or hose had a leak. There was supposed to be an audio alert, but he had gotten none. With a profound amount of disregard, he opened up the throttle on his jetpack.
Hey, E?
Yes?
I'm losing O2, buddy. I'm hauling back to the airlock. See if you can get someone to work the door for me.
Which one?
He sounded a little frantic.
It's a...
His mind went blank. Which airlock had he come out of? Which one was closest?
14, I think.
On it. How much do you have left?
He asked. Jeremy could hear some yelling in the background, probably Sela. Jeremy's peripheral vision started to darken, and focusing was getting really, really difficult.
Probably not enough,
He said solemnly.
Hurry! We'll have the door open for you.
He glanced at his reading, but it was a blur now, a very, very short red blur instead of a long row of green glowing bars. He really needed to concentrate on his speed, but it was all he could do to just stay awake. The airlock came into view and the outer door was wide open, and he swore he could see Dee through the porthole. It didn't matter. Even if Dee was trying to kill him, everyone knew he was coming into airlock 14. Was he going too fast? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he was out of time. The airlock was getting really big, really fast. Yep, time to reverse thrust. Jeremy found that his hands were numb and realized that he was about to become very intimate with the inner airlock door very soon. The big numbers above the door came into focus momentarily. 13, they read. His vision dimmed to black, then he heard a bang and a clatter, then finally, nothing.